to Sidebar, Don't Judge Me's mini episodes. I am Vaidehi Mehta and joined here today by the one, the only Joe Fabush.
Hey, thank you. You did such a better job introing than I did on our last podcast together. That's great.
I always
good start.
It's okay. We always blank on the intros, and I do mean the one, the only Joe, because the rest of our team is out. Everyone's coming down with something, and it's not necessarily COVID, right? I guess 'tis the season for the flu cooties.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, although it's good that it's more of the usual stuff. It's
I suppose
the colds and the flus. We can handle that, right?
Oh man, I guess so. So we lost Miss Laura Temmie today, but we're here with you, doing a slightly more serious sidebar because it's important. Because it's not just flu season, folks. It's voting season, right?
If you didn't know it from the 8 million advertisements you've probably seen just today.
Oh my gosh. Or text messages.
Yeah, oh, I know. Yeah.
Every time I get excited that I'm actually popular and someone wants to text me, I find out that it's a Dem or Republic, people from all parts of the spectrum.
Oh, yeah.
And often they think it's like, they address me as my mother's name, my brother's name. I'm just like, at least get my name right if you're going to try to convince me to vote for you. At least try.
I mean, I've been Mr. Joe a time or two. Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
It's funny. But.
Yes, I've been Mr. Vaidehi a time or two.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But all that is to say, as annoying as these voting ads are, it's still important to practice your civic duty and constitutional right, maybe? Right to vote, kind of, theoretically.
Let's get into it, yeah.
Let's get into it. Do we have a right to vote, Joe? I feel like that's the idea, considering I was not born in the United States, and so when I went for my citizenship stuff, one of the citizenship questions that you have to practice for your interview is, what's the most important right? And the answer is supposed to be the right to vote. What's the most important right a citizen gets? Yeah, and then ironically, I don't know if you believe in voter disenfranchisement. I know it's a contentious issue if it's targeted at any specific people, but let's just say the right to vote is there in theory, but not always in practice.
Yeah, we've had a lot of history in this country and in our democracy with voting rights both given and taken away. And I think you've got some information for us that you can maybe go through about some of the history of voting rights in the U.S.
Well, I mean, where are most rights that we have found, right? You might think the Constitution, that would be an obvious place to start. Well, and this shouldn't be surprising for people. The original Constitution didn't give everyone the right to vote. And in fact, it didn't even talk about the right to vote for anyone. The only place that the OG Constitution mentioned voting was in Article 1, Section 4. They talk about time, place, manner, right? They say that the states can regulate the time, place, manner of holding elections. And Congress can make a law to regulate it if it chooses to, but that's basically it, right? Mm-hmm. It's talking about how elections and polling is held. It's not talking about the right to vote for anyone. So the power to decide the right to vote was originally and for a long time left to the states. And the upshot of this being, of course, that there was a lot of variability across the country on who could vote depending on what state you were in. And the other consequence of this is that regulating voting became cemented as a states' right issue. And of course, this isn't unique to voting. It's just one of many issues that have since the dawn of our country been pulled into the federalism battle, the competing interests of individual states to govern themselves versus a unified national government. And this could be a part of the reason why regulating voting is a partisan issue between Dems and Republicans. I don't know what you think, Joe. I guess if we're generous and if we give politicians credit to stick to their ideological guns, you could point to the fact that generally more politically conservative people these days lean into states' rights and don't like the federal government telling them what to do. So,
yeah, I don't know about politics, but I can certainly, just because I'm, I'm not a political wonk, but I do follow this.
Andy, where are you? We need you.
Yeah, we do need him. But I can talk a little bit, about the Supreme Court because that certainly is Justice Roberts' position, the Chief Justice. He tends to be very hesitant when the federal government is saying voting rights, but he's quite lenient when it comes to states deciding their own election laws. So there's certainly a strain of judicial conservatism that I think you're capturing pretty well right there.
Yeah. And of course, the Supreme Court matters so much because, as I said, there's very little in the constitutional text, at least the original Constitution, even the amended Constitution, to protect explicitly to protect the right to vote. And so a lot of it has been up to judicial interpretation. That's why the Supreme Court sort of makes or breaks a lot of voter disenfranchisement cases, as we've seen.
Absolutely.
But either way, the consequences of the fact that our constitutional history has left so much up to the states is evident to this day. You'll see many disparities from state to state regarding how voting takes place. So polling places in different states have like different hours, early voting rules are different, voter ID requirements are different, different rules about if felons can vote. And it's bad enough when things are different from state to state. I say bad enough. Some people will be like, no, states need different rules because they have different demographics and it has to be tailored to the needs of different states. Okay, but if the upshot is that people or citizens of different states are treated differently and have different rights, even though we're all United States citizens, then it becomes, an equal protection issue, right? So that's what I mean when I say it's bad enough when things are different from state to state. But even more so, it's more granular than that because there are actually different rules county by county within states too, or different rules governing different types of elections. So one big one in the past few years, of course, especially with COVID, has been the disparities in voting by mail or absentee voting. So some states will, for example, allow counties to opt in to certain policies like voting by mail. So then how you can vote ends up really depending on where you live, not just which state you're voting in. So in the 2020 election, for example, 4 states, including Nevada, Vermont, Utah, and finally, and very importantly, California, adopted this idea of universal mail-in ballots that a lot of states had sort of been resistant to, and COVID, of course, understandably pushed because people didn't want to go in person, right? And the idea of universal mail-in ballots is giving the option of voting via mail, even though you could still vote in person if you wanted to. And that latter part is a big deal, of course, because if you only did mail-in ballots, which is, what some people think you should do, that would disenfranchise unhoused people or people who move around a lot like I do. I'm gonna tell you now, I've had the worst headache trying to get my absentee ballot this year because a combination of proof of residency requirements and voter ID requirements, like Georgia, where I'm registered, it's always been a holdout for easy voting processes, including absentee or vote by mail. So it either requires you to show a Georgia driver's license, which, plenty of people don't have a driver's license. Many people don't drive. Mine happens to be from Washington because I bought my car in Washington and they had their own rules that I could only register my car there if I changed my Georgia driver's license to Washington. So conflicting state requirements will butt heads. So there's sometimes that, or you have to show proof of residency in the form of like a utilities bill. And what about the people that don't pay utilities or they live with family or pay rent under the table, right? A lot of folks moved back in with their families in COVID. A lot of college students are moving back in with their families because of student debt and not being able to have jobs. So especially in the post-COVID world where there are a lot more people working remotely and have started to be a little bit more nomadic, like me maybe, like it gets really hard to vote sometimes.
Yeah, and I do want to put in a plug because if you, dear listener, have not figured it out yet, voting laws can be very complicated. So if you're wondering about voting requirements for your particular county, for your state, you can go to FindLaw.com/voting. We have comprehensive articles on mail-in ballots, on state laws regarding voting. So it's too much to cover in one podcast, but we try to make it easy on you. There's lots of other resources out there for you to figure out how the best way to vote for you is and what you need to bring to the poll or to get a mail-in ballot. So we definitely try to make it as easy as possible. And if you don't want to come to us, go to someplace else, because we definitely want you to vote if you're interested in voting.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes. Some great resources from FindLaw, courtesy of Joe and his team. We got, like we said, the original Constitution saying basically nothing about the right to vote. But of course, we know that's changed, right? We're not living to this day, thank God, with the original Constitution. Most obviously in the form of the many amendments that do talk about voting. That's where we see the language. So 15th Amendment is probably the most famous one. 1870, in the aftermath of the Civil War, this amendment, of course, prohibits the government from denying citizens the right to vote based on race. At the time, of course, it was directed at former slaves, but since has been applied to people of all and any color. And then, of course, you have you have the famous 19th Amendment, much later in 1919, which was responsive to the women's suffrage movement and provided the right to vote regardless of gender. A few other notable mentions are the 23rd Amendment, which gives D.C. citizens the right to vote about time, and the 24th Amendment, which prohibits poll taxes. We'll get a little bit more into what poll taxes are later. And the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18. I think it was like 21 in some states. I know in Georgia it was 21 for a minute. And so going back to poll taxes, which are very much legal, they were a hot button issue for a long time in our country's history. And I will just bring up a famous or infamous case called Breedlove. Breedlove has fortunately since been overturned, but it originally upheld poll taxes, which, sorry, I didn't even define. Hopefully poll taxes are what they sound like.
I think they are pretty self-explanatory, okay. But yeah, go ahead. Let's they come in different forms, I think. I mean, we don't see them now, I hope. So I think historically they've been like either a direct or indirect way of charging people. In Breedlove's case, it was sort of an indirect way of charging people. So the facts of Breedlove, I'll just explain to you. So originally Breedlove upheld poll taxes, a Supreme Court case upholding them. And I think this was actually a really interesting case because it's not what you'd think. It wasn't a direct poll tax. It wasn't like on election day, oh, you want to vote? Okay, we're going to charge you $1. Because at that time, apparently $1 was a lot, I'm sure it was.
It was. Okay, so again, Breedlove involves my state, Georgia. Hello. They gave a sort of blanket tax, not directly related to polls, but Georgia tried to tax all of its citizens $1, which who knows what that was? Maybe it was $100 back in the day. I don't know. It was more than it was significant, I guess.
What year was it?
That was in 1937 is when it was decided.
So right in the middle or at the tail end of the Great Depression. So yeah, I bet $1 was quite a bit. Yeah,
$1 went a long way, and Georgia just tried to tax everybody $1. And if you didn't pay this tax, then you couldn't register to vote. So in that way, it was indirect. But it exempted people under or over a certain age, like under 21, over 60, from this tax. And it exempted females. And this was after the 19th Amendment. And remember, the 19th Amendment is the right to vote regardless of sex. It was after the 19th Amendment had passed, so women could obviously vote. So Nolan Breedlove, who was a white male, sued under both the 14th Amendments in the Equal Protection Clause and the Privileges and Immunities Clause. You'll see a lot of voting rights cases decided under the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment. And also under the 19th Amendment, and Breedlove argued that it wasn't fair that basically only males between 21 and 60 had to pay a poll tax. And the Supreme Court upheld that tax on the grounds that differences between men and women needed to be accounted for, and, quote, women may be exempted on the basis of special considerations to which they are naturally entitled, in view of burdens necessarily borne by them for the preservation of the race. And there they mean there they mean sex, not race. The fair.
Well, yeah, I mean, what they're
Yeah.
saying is basically because, women
Yeah.
need to be in the home and taking care of babies to preserve the human
Yeah.
species. And so that's kind of what they're getting at, right?
Yeah. And which really flies in the face of equal protection on the basis of sex. But again, equal protection on the basis of sex, I think, hadn't been established then. We had the 19th Amendment, but that's not equality for women. It's just the right to vote for women.
Yeah.
And so, so this was obviously an issue and was addressed through the 24th Amendment, which was adopted in 1964, which outlawed the poll tax in federal elections. But that was only for federal elections, which was the case in Breedlove and what the 24th Amendment addressed. So the 24th Amendment did not speak to the question of state elections, which was the question involved in the case that overturned Breedlove, the Harper case. So the issue of state elections using poll taxes was addressed by a case called Harper v. Virginia State Board of Elections. And again, that overturned Breedlove, thank God. So that's why we don't have poll taxes anymore. So in that case, Harper, who was a female, but not really relevant actually, Harper brought this suit on behalf of herself and other poor residents of Virginia. And the state of Virginia required a poll tax for state elections. So the Supreme Court was kind of divided on this. I think it was 6-3. Ultimately ruled in favor of Harper. So they said that, quote, a state violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment whenever it makes the affluence of the voter or payment of any fee an electoral standard. Voter qualifications have no relation to wealth, unquote. So huge move, because from the get-go, not only has the right, quote unquote, to vote been an issue of race and sort of class, like a sort of gender and sex, but also class and largely like land ownership, right? It was originally given to land-owning white males. So
Well, and you're just bringing up one of what could be numerous examples. Some states tried to implement questionnaires that you had to complete. The face value of that was to make sure that it was an informed citizenry
yep.
who was voting. But of course, when you walked into the polling place, it was up to the guy there to give you the questions and determine whether you passed or failed. And there is some pretty obvious issues with corruption, not to mention it's not a great idea to begin with. Ultimately, there's been a lot of ways in which certain population groups, whether they're poor, whether they're not landowning, whether they're black, whether they're women. So we've had a long history, and it's a really fascinating topic historically, just to see all of the various things that states have done.
And a lot of it, I mean, the buck stopped with some of these constitutional amendments. And since then, like I said, it's been a combination of the Supreme Court interpreting things, because it's not that easy to amend the Constitution, obviously, or it's been a lot of federal legislation. For example, the enforcement acts were what gave the federal government the power to enforce the constitutional provisions, right? Or notably, the Voting Rights Act, which was in 1965 after the Civil Rights Act. President Johnson basically urged Congress to pass this law in order to overcome what was continued resistance in the South, unsurprisingly, to broad voting rights, right? Just because we had these amendments and the enforcement acts where the federal government could enforce the amendments doesn't mean that people mean governments, doesn't mean that governments were actually complying, right? So they had a number of federal legislation was passed, including, like I said, the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act provided extra protections on more bases. For example, literacy. So Voting Rights Act provides that a person can't be denied the right to vote using literacy tests. And now we have protections against discrimination on language, sexual orientation, religion, disability, national origin. But that's from a combination of federal legislation. And again, that's going to fly in the face of people who want states' right, or, federalists who want states to be able to decide issues like voting and who can and can't vote and how time, place, manner restrictions too. Because even if you only allow the states to regulate time, place, and manner, which is part of the Constitution, if states are doing so much as, let's have our voting day on Tuesday, even though every other country has it on like a Sunday or gets a national holiday to vote, it's going to disenfranchise people who are working more 9-to-5 jobs and can't easily get out, right?
Yeah. And so, there's so many things to talk about with voting. But some of these issues are still very much with us. And I know.
Yeah. This is very meta, but one of the main hot button issues in this midterm election is voting rights. Right, Joe?
Yeah, I'm not going to go through a summary of every state because I could do that because almost every state has introduced legislation in some form. Some have gone farther than others. Some have just been introduced without any real drive behind them. Literally hundreds of bills have been introduced in state legislatures, usually by passing more restrictive voting measures. Kind of the buzzword for this is election interference. That's generally the term given to making sure that only people who are eligible to vote can vote. So these are some of the things you were talking about before, Vedihi, with early voting, drop boxes, mail-in voting, voting without a photo ID. We do have to note that there have been no convincing cases regarding voter fraud in the U.S. It's never been shown that voting fraud has occurred in a widespread manner. Instances of voting fraud occur in every election, going back to our founding, but it's usually smaller examples. We don't want to get too far down this political rabbit hole. But it is fair to say that it is a partisan issue. Republican legislators are more interested in passing election integrity bills, and then Democrats generally target expanding access to voting by trying to make mail-in voting easier. So, depending on your view of the current state of our electoral process, whether you think think widespread fraud occurs or not, probably will play a big role in how you view the upcoming election. There isn't a ton happening at the federal level. The House did pass a bill in early September about refuting the vice president's ability to unilaterally declare state election results invalid. And this is, what Trump asked then Vice President Mike Pence to do after the election, the 2020 election. But that has not become law, and it's not clear that that's going to become law. So there's not so much happening at the federal level, but there is a ton happening at the state and local
Which is
levels.
why midterms are so important, even though people, of course, presidential elections get all the buzz, but people don't often pay attention to midterms, often don't turn up in midterms, but that is where local election laws that may or may not disenfranchise you are going to be set, right? Whoever is the incumbent, who is elected at the midterms, are going to set future election laws that will infringe or expand your right to vote. And so in 2018, fun personal anecdote, in 2018, I was denied my absentee ballot thrice. I applied for it 3 times, and it was denied on grounds like signature not a match, even though I think I know my own signature, or like, the 2018 in Georgia specifically was there was a lot of national coverage on voter disenfranchisement, specifically for people with ethnic sounding names or people of color. Whether or not you believe in that, I am just saying that my absentee ballot was denied 3 times. And when it was finally approved, I never got it in the mail. So, yeah.
So you were actually denied for not having a signature match. Really?
Twice for not having a signature match, and once for I don't even know. It was something ridiculous. I can't even remember what the third reason was. And then the 4th time, it was approved and allegedly sent out to my Michigan address where I was at law school. I didn't re-register in Michigan because I was there temporarily in law school, and I never got it in the mail because there is no accountability for when people send out absentee ballots. There's no tracking number. If they say they sent it out and you don't get it, there is nothing you can do about it. And yeah, I was contacted by the ACLU. It was like a whole thing. Georgia was particularly notorious in 2018. So that's why Georgia election is very important again this year, but any election is very important. Any midterm election is particularly important for those who are concerned about preserving their voting rights in the future. So get out there, folks.
Thanks for listening to Sidebar from FindLaw's Don't Judge Me. We'll be releasing these every other week between our full-length episodes. Please subscribe to, rate, and review our show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if there's a topic you'd like to hear us cover, send us an email at FindLawPodcast@ThomsonReuters.com.